Very simply, what is futures thinking?
But before we even ask that, I always set up futures as a learning journey. And what happens is the future is so overwhelming, so much data, Jetsons, technology, robots, and people get overwhelmed. So the way often people construct futures as things out there, new technologies. And I try to ask people, well, what do you do about all that? So one thing is, how do you react to the future? That's kind of basic, number one. What do I do differently?
Yeah.
The problem with that is we're reacting to the future. So futures thinking is saying, how am I living the future? Am I living someone else's dream? How do I reshape my future so it makes sense to me?
So that reaction could be a bit like feeling like we're on the back foot all the time.
Yeah.
When it comes to change.
Yeah. So I know with Gold Coast City Council, they asked me this question a few years ago, and they said they're busy. I said, as a city council, you're always going to be busy. Mm-hmm. Every organization is always busy. There's tons to do. The metaphor for me is the firefighter. Of course we need firefighters, but what a percent of the time are we doing prevention, thinking through what might cause tomorrow's fires?
My sense is that, and my history in planning suggested that a lot of the ways that these reactions were to have a plan. And
so planning is one way. We would say there's danger out there, uncertainty, let's set it up.
Yeah.
The problem with the plan, it assumes one future. Futures thinking is saying not to one future, but scenarios, multiple futures.
So by default, it could lock us into only a future.
Yeah. So future thinking is always saying, how is the future changing? For that to work, going back to my learning context, I have to ask myself, how is the world changing? Do I have the appropriate paradigm, worldview to handle that? So I was in Amsterdam a few weeks ago, and I was looking for a place to wash laundry. And everyone said it's right there in that square. And I kept on looking, and I couldn't find it because it was underground. So my framework was these stores should be above ground. So I didn't have the right paradigm or framework to see what I needed to see. So Foresight is going from what's my future, what are the alternative futures, to what do I need to change about how I see the world to have more choices, more possibility.
So then what I'm taking away from that message is one version of understanding and using the future or knowing the future can actually limit us in our ability to be quite adaptive with
That's
it.
exactly it. So one is adapting. Is my organization, am I more adaptable? But the deepest part of Foresight, again, is almost a cliche. If you want to predict the future, invent it. Mm-hmm. Now, to invent the future, you have to get clear on what are my assets? How do I use the future? In that sense, the future is not about new technologies. The future in itself becomes an asset. It becomes malleable. It becomes something I can play with. So transformation is using the future differently to create alternative and preferred futures.
So how can we use the future as an asset?
The idea of the future as an asset is a disruptive term. We normally think of labor as an asset, technology as an asset. In this way, seeing the future as an asset, it's an input into the world we wish for. It's an input into changing today. It's an input into questioning today. So the future for me becomes malleable. You can use it in different ways.
But how can I use something that doesn't exist?
The future always exists because it's an idea we already have. So the future could be, what's a different world we want? That's an asset. The future could be, hey, bad things could happen. Are we prepared for it? Contingency. So the future could be, what's my story? So I have a story about the way the world could be. It's a metaphor about the future. For example, is the future like rolling dice, randomness? Is the future like I'm on a train that's only going in one direction? Is the future like a jet plane? So I can go anywhere.
How does then metaphors play a role here?
Well, the crucial part is we're always living a story. So foresight, to me, defined is the understanding and shaping of alternative and preferred futures and the worldviews and metaphors that underlie them. So metaphor is always active in the future. What we try to do is, those in the futures field, is ask organizations, individuals, what's your own metaphor of the future? And now the challenge is there's no right or wrong metaphor. With one ministry I was working, Ministry of Education, the metaphor they had of education was force feed. Now that may make sense in a command control perspective. We have knowledge, here's what students will learn. But the foresight argument is the world is shifting, new technologies, peer-to-peer revolutions. So students say, well, we don't want to be force-fed. So one way to handle that tug of war is to say, what might be a different metaphor? So again, with this ministry, their alternative metaphor, well, actually, let's move to an a la carte system where the student has more flexibility, more choice. But then some of the ministry said, well, if it's a la carte, they have full choice. We still are responsible for national curricula. So their third metaphor, which fit the culture, was the healthy buffet. So it won't be just, here's what you'll take. Well, here's 6, 7 alternatives, but we've done some research. Parents want this, teachers want this, the ministry wants this. So now we have a negotiated future called the healthy buffet. So if the future becomes an asset to change our paradigm, change our strategy.
You often hear the word transforming, transformational. How does that really link in terms of what you just described around metaphor?
Well, traditional foresight was prediction. Tell us what will happen. So many CEOs, they want someone doing futures research to say, tell me consumer demand in 2020. What will the future client look like? How many people will be disabled in 2020?
So transforming was then understood as getting it right.
Yes. They didn't want transformation. The goal of foresight was to give accurate data on future supply or demand. Now, people doing it after a while said, well, as you go into the future in terms of time, you get a whole range of uncertainties. Will there be new types of disease, brain injury? Mm-hmm. How will space change? How will cities change? So then you start to think through, okay, it's not just getting it right, it's having scenarios. The transformation part is, okay, well, we have our scenarios, we have an alternatives, but that's not enough either. It's really inventing this alternative future. So transformation says, here's our data, here's our scenarios, here's how we're going to change our culture to come to our preferred future. So my hypothesis in transformation is, if we don't go the cultural deeper part, then culture eats strategy for breakfast. So in that sense, we want to find a new story that can help create the new future.
I suppose this, for me, the role of leadership then comes into conversation here, because I could then assume that transformation was necessarily the realm of the leader or the executive or the CEO. How do you see that shifting now?
See, that's dependent. Again, leadership used to be hierarchical, how to make the great man even greater. And that's let's climb the mountaintop. The challenge to that has been, because of digital technologies, a general move towards peer-to-peer. So shift 1 was the leader climbing the mountain. Shift 2 was the leader enabling people so they could climb their own mountain. Shift 3 is cooperative, dispersed, distributive leadership. So the strategic foresight aspect of it is, okay, here's our new vision. How do we get there? Well, does leader just say, here's where we're going, or is it co-created? So the shift right now is more and more towards co-creation, because people want that. There was a fantastic new survey in one country, and the citizens were very clear. We want our leaders to set the vision, and we want leaders to enable to create peer-to-peer democratic networks.
So this term, strategic foresight, my experience sometimes tells me that it gets misunderstood. So can you just expand a bit and define what we mean by strategic foresight?
Well, generally, foresight will be, how is the future changing? What's my role in it? What are the alternatives? The strategy part is, okay, given these alternatives, what might I do differently? So if there's going to be more risk in the future because of new technologies, climate change, and you're an insurer, how do you insure differently?
So when you say you mean more than just the leader of an organization, but rather everyone involved?
It could be. I mean, this is often the case. The data suggests it's more distributive, but it could be based on the metaphor of the organization. The organization might see themselves as a mountaintop. In that sense, it may make more sense to stay hierarchical.
So I want to bring you back now to this definition of strategic foresight.
Okay.
So let's go back there. And in the simple terms, then, it could be defined as what?
So the foresight part is the creation of alternative and preferred futures with an understanding of the worldviews and metaphors that underlie them. The strategy part, once I've done the research, the workshop, the data gathering, what do we, whoever we is, do differently? So traditional strategy was, let's look at the problems and then we act. So again, one of my favorite stories is from my own professor, Jim Data in Hawaii. They ran a problem-solving workshop, and their conclusion was the biggest issue facing, in this case, the courts, was lack of parking spaces. Now that's important, but that's not critical.
Mm-hmm.
And so then he thought, wait a second, the way we're setting up this entire process is wrong. We should be thinking about how to solve tomorrow's problems today. Now for the leadership part, if I'm solving tomorrow's problems today, how do I get legitimacy for myself? How do I get credit? So then, of course, making it more democratic makes more sense. So as a group, we're anticipating tomorrow's problems. We're engaged in prevention to see, is the road we're on the right road? Do we need to shift roads?
I imagine that also would help with the mitigation of risk as well, because you're
Exactly.
diffusing the analysis across all
Yes.
those in the organization.
Yeah. So traditional risk assessment was, okay, what might be the new technology, the financial risk? This is saying there's a worldview risk.
Right.
If in fact the way I see the world is a risk, how do I ensure robustness so I include other people in the act of thinking through futures?
So if I'm a leader, then it means making sure my own assumptions then are out there for as part of the analysis.
Yeah. I did a project for a board of directors in the veterinarian field. And they were thinking through the future of their organization.
Hmm.
And what they quickly figured out, they asked themselves the question, who's not in the room?
Hmm.
And who's not in the room, young vets weren't in the room. So if we're doing the vision for 2030 and our key stakeholders aren't there, then of course we're taking a huge worldview risk.
So that could be both in and outside the organisation.
Yes, yes.
Who are
So-
part of that future.
So good futures research always asks the question, who's not in the room? Because they may have an answer, a framework that could be an asset.
So using the future as an asset, as an individual, evokes to me, in my own mind, the challenge of understanding my own change story and how do I assume, make sense of the future, but more importantly, what are those assumptions or stories that have shaped who I am today? So how successfully you have developed a very user-friendly and elegant framework in doing strategic foresight, so that I can start to think about how I could use foresight in my own change story. Can you expand and explain a little bit that six-pillared method?
So the 6 pillars approach, the first pillar is mapping. And the idea of mapping, there's a method called Futures Triangle. It's basically saying, what's your image of the future? What's the push? These are critical drivers, new technologies, demographics, aging of population, for example. What are the weights? What are the barriers preventing me? So that creates a contingent map. It's like if you're in a foreign city, you need a map to get around, right? Where are the roads? Where are the subways?
So in the case of the health services sector and the disability sectors, then they could understand the drivers of change, and predominantly some of those are very obvious, such as the National Disability Insurance Agency and the scheme itself.
Yeah, so that's pushing the future in a certain way. Then you ask yourself, what's stopping it? Is it bureaucracy? Is it an old model of leadership? Is it funding? Then you ask yourself, well, where do we want to go to? What do we want disability services to look like in 2025? So once you have a basic map, that gives you a sense of what the future could look like. But that's part one of the pillars. The second pillar is anticipation. That's saying what might disturb the map. What if robotics, we know we're moving more and more towards nursing care. Genomics, how might genomic intervention change disability? How might city design that's disabled person friendly? Whether roads or lighting, or in hospitals, we know there's so many causes of death is often the fall, because hospital design is not built for aging population. What if you had hospitals that had those soft floors? So you start to ask yourself, how might in the future, going out 10, 15 years, what might change?
I suppose that to some degree that would then make it more explicit, some of those more dominant stories for the disability futures.
Well, the story part is not yet. I mean, this is really emerging issues analysis, is what are disruptors, new technologies, changes that challenge my map of the future. So once you've done that, now your map has shifted. You said, oh my God, I never thought about that. So what one health insurance group, they were insuring illness. They started to think through, okay, given if there's personal genomics, if there's prevention, change in diet, people get healthier, are we in the right area? Should we now be thinking about becoming knowledge navigators?
For me, I think the anticipation is a crucial one because it really does make explicit who's doing the anticipating and, more importantly, who's not in the room of the anticipation
And
process.
that's also important. So you get better information about the future the more people you include. So in one project on child safety, we asked the people in the room who were leading detectives, commissioners, are you getting advice from young people who may be vulnerable? They may have information or knowledge or even a way of thinking and insight that can help you make children more safer in the future. As it turns out, we had some of the leading police commissioners in the world say, yes, let me think about that. How do I get different types of information?
So pillar one, mapping,
Yes.
looking at what's creating our plausible future. Pillar two, anticipating
Yes.
what are those range of options. Can you expand then now to pillar three, timing?
Pillar 3 is timing the future. The notion there are there deeper patterns of the future. If you work in organizations, after a while, you start to see them.
So these patterns are like understanding change.
Understanding change. And we've noticed there's at least four are critical. One is the pendulum. So you see the organization shift, for example, between heavy centralization, heavy decentralization. You also see another pattern, linear. Linear is that every 5 years things get better, more funding, more resources. There's also cyclical, which is decline. And there's also spiral where you're transforming, going in the future, but some of the past stays with you. That's
So then, let me see if I'm getting this. In that, by understanding these patterns of change, somewhere in there I need to think, well, where am I?
exactly. So if I know we've suddenly moved to a heavy centralization, then arguing for decentralization is not going to work.
So this then will influence in terms of my response to change.
Exactly. So you're not reacting. I now see the pattern in my organization, in my country, in my city. I can optimize my strategy for social change. If it's a linear movement up, then of course things will get much easier, much better. It's like a huge wave coming, and you can ride the wave. If, however, it's a downward cycle, then you think through, what should I do in a downward cycle? How do I get inspiration? How do I work with people when there'll be less funding, less resources, less access available?
So if I can understand my own social model of change, what works for me, where I am in the pattern, and then potentially my responses, I can then sort of adapt to where I am in this pattern of change, and that makes sense to me.
And you may decide to fight against it, but
Okay.
at least I'm conscious of what's going on at a deeper level. So for example, you see waves where if you look at the pendulum, there could be a period people are saying, let's do more research in genomics. In disability, we have to fix people who are disabled. Then the pendulum shifts. We don't need to fix anyone. It's really, how do we change society to make it more disabled person friendly? Redesign the city. And you see these patterns back and forth.
So in one sense, I could actually evoke my own leadership to influence the timing of the patterning.
Yeah. In that sense, if you're doing that, then I get the spiral. The spiral is saying, okay, I see this back and forth between, say, science and system change. How do I integrate both?
Well, this policy versus that policy.
Yes. So that's wise fit. By knowing the timing pattern of the change, I can wisely influence the future.
Okay, so now it leads us on to the fourth pillar, the pillar of deepening. Now this is, I think, one of the most profound pillars, and the methods associated is called causal-aid analysis. Can you explain?
Causal-aid analysis simply suggests there's 4 levels of reality. The litany, the data, we see every day, headlines. Level 2 is the system, how we organize the data. You might say that's systemic change, society, technology, economy. Level 3 is worldview. Level 3 is the deep metaphor. So this suggests we have to work as activists, futurists, at all 4 levels.
So then in deepening my understanding of the future, really what you're saying is you're trying to deepen your understanding of the issues shaping
Yes.
the future, but also importantly the solutions.
Yeah. So in one fantastic workshop with National Disability Services, they said, well, let's look at how the big worldviews, the stakeholders see the future. So government might see itself as a gatekeeper. People who are activists may see themselves as, we have the right answer.
So these different stakeholders will have a different perspective on.
Yeah. Well, when we're doing causal-aid analysis, we want to see how do the different stakeholders see the future. For example, at one workshop at a university, when we did the analysis, the professor's core story was work from home. And then with the students, their main story was run away from parents. So the issue was, do we put money in building more student housing? From the view of academics, no. Money should be an infrastructure for broadband. From students, they want to grow up and get away from home. They want to move to campus. So scenario one would be, well, a university where there's students but no academics. So you start to think through, well, what's the wise way to use our funding, our infrastructure development, given these different perspectives. The mistake organizations make is they don't see how these multiple perspectives shape the future. They only see it from one view. CLA broadens the discourse.
So in the sense of, or in terms of the health services sector and the disability sectors, that would mean taking considerations of those different stakeholders, being parents and families, the person with disabilities, the bureaucrat, the private enterprise. So
Yes.
there's a range here, isn't there?
There was one brilliant conference, 2005. It was a 2-3 day conference, and we started to think through what are the solutions using CLA as a framework. So something that became very powerful, we had someone who said, right now I'm known as Julie, the blind person, on apartment 3.
Yeah.
And in her news story, I would want to be known as just Julie. Now that's the story, but the story must be matched with systemic change. So that means how do we redesign buildings, apartments, cities? So it's both. It's changing the deep story, but also changing system design.
So Julie then brings an alternative scenario.
Yes.
So then leads us now onto pillar 5, which is creating alternatives so that we honour the Julie stories. And so pillar 5 is really about creating alternative futures through methods of scenarios.
Yes. There's multiple techniques. There's 2 I'll mention right now.
Yeah.
One is if I'm in an organization, an easy way to go forward is say, what's our best case? Then we might ask, well, what's our worst case if we don't change? And we might say, what's business as usual if things continue going on the next 20 years? And then from emerging issues analysis, we say, what's the outlier?
So really what we're doing in scenarios is locating uncertainty with a degree of certainty in scenarios.
Yeah, you want to say, there's so much going out there, let's manage the information. And the reason why that works is most people are used to only one future.
Oh.
So if I say multiple futures, they slightly freak. I say, well, no, we can contour this. Best case, worst case, business as usual, outlier. The other reason it works is, say you're an organization that doesn't want to shift. Then you say to them, well, look, if we do nothing, what happens in 10, 15 years? People say, oh my God, we'll be behind the 8 ball. Okay, how about if we totally do nothing and bad things happen? What's worst case? And then you ask, what's the best case? So it gets people to shift their cognitive framework.
So I suppose the benefit of having then these scenarios developed is also they would then honour and reflect some of the different stakeholder perspectives, the different framing of the issues and potentially solutions around the different futures. So it sort of creates this space for renegotiating then what is the ultimate preferred or desired future.
But that moves then from pillar 5 to pillar 6, which is transformation. So pillar 5 looks at alternatives, and you ask the stakeholders in each different future, what does your life look like? In the best case, worst case, business as usual, outlier. Then they get a sense, here's what it will mean. Pillar 6, transforming and saying, what do you wish the future to be authentically be like? So we had one mayor in a city, we were trying to make the case why change was important. So the comment was, okay, if you do nothing, given current demographic trends, crime trends, what would your city look like? They said, well, it'll be unsafe. It won't be person-friendly. It won't be community-friendly. We said, okay, now let's imagine your preferred future. It was very clear. Less cars, more greenery, organic gardens, rooftop gardens, a building design that basically honors the individual in the community. So people wanted to do that. So first it's important to figure out then, where do you wish to be like? What does 2025 look like? So transformation is getting very clear. Yes, risk assessment, looking at alternatives, but truly the question is, what's my desired future?
So this is really then is pulling together and creating this alignment of all stakeholders towards this preferred future.
It could, you could do it for your family, your own life. For an organization, of course, all stakeholders. For disability services, yes, everyone in the field. Here's where we wish to go. Now, sometimes there's disagreement and you honor that disagreement.
How? How did you do
Well,
that?
you can see, here's one group's preferred future, here's the second group. You could look for win-win stuff. So in one city, one group wanted this incredible green city.
So I don't have to capitulate to the dominant preferred.
No,
We
you
can
can have a
actually hold-
negotiation. And the other group said, no, we want heavy urbanization, we want glamour. And finally, after we negotiated the futures, the glamour group said, well, the reality is we won't have glamour if there's sea rise. The city will disappear. And the green people said, well, green is a great ideology, it's a value system, but if we don't connect with people and make it fun and exciting and doable, people won't change. So we found a way to negotiate the preferred.
I suppose I just want to reiterate this point then, though. It's not then the preferred future singular, but preferred futures plural.
It can be. Again, it's dependent.
Okay.
So with one organization, they wanted to know what's our preferred future, and then we worked with everyone there to come up with a shared future. Now, often what happens when you do the preferred vision, there's a loss of hope. And I asked groups why. I said, we've imagined 2025, we're not sure we can get there. So the transformation technique is backcasting. It's a simple question. You're in 2025, what happened the last 10, 11 years? Don't give me a ton of data, give me a map of the past. So often, you don't have to change everything. You have to figure out what are 3 things that need to shift from now to the future. So you don't want to overwhelm people. You want to find, in our capacity, our zone of control, what needs to shift. So the backcasting gives a powerful way to come up with a strategic foresight plan.
So initially, these simple steps towards our preferred is helping us then to realise the desired changes we want.
Yeah.
And it can be as simple as just taking one project or one action towards that preferred.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be complex, but the benefit could be that we're actually then engaging in foresight.
The benefit is two. One is there's a sense of, cynicism. It may not happen. What if it doesn't happen? Skepticism. It will never happen. So you want to engage people in heart, head, body to say what needs to be done.
But even that would be a scenario.
Well, so that's not a scenario. That's the capacity part. Here's our vision. Here's how we got there. The act of then doing the action learning gets people involved in changing. So then the crucial part for me as the metaphor is the path is the goal. So the pathway creates the goal. And to do that, you have the vision. And as you start on that, the vision becomes real by doing something different.
I suppose the point I was making about, if you come across those who say it's not possible, whatever.
Yes.
Part of them is actually bringing in the risk mitigation along the pathway.
Okay, now your point is brilliant. So the scenario becomes, here's why it won't work. You said, yeah, okay, right. Our preferred future is this. Worst case, it doesn't work.
Yeah.
And then you mitigate.
Yes.
Okay, tell me in your worst case scenario why it won't work. This, well, we'll lose funding by 2018. We won't get the award by 2022. Okay, great. So 2 things we need to do very clearly. Get the funding, have a system of measurement that incentivizes it. Exactly.
So bringing in these voices is once again using them as an asset, as you said before, in creating the desired future.
So again, people want leadership to be visionary and truly participatory. Both have to work.
So if we think then of success, using strategic foresight as a means to creating success and where we ought to go as a preferred future, are there any critical success factors that we need to be sensitive to?
Well, I would challenge the default future. If we do nothing.
What do you mean by default?
Default is if I do nothing. If I continue unconsciously into the future, what's going to happen? Do I wish to change it? We know certain diets, certain patterns of behavior don't lead to the preferred future. So first, challenge the default. Now, once you challenge default and there's change, people go to the use future.
What do you mean by that?
Well, use feature is something we keep on doing over and over, even though the data science tells us it's not going to work. It's kind of the comfort zone.
It's a bit like, it sounds like borrowing from something.
It could be. Like, for example, we know in policing, best policing behavior is you look at where the areas of crime and you put your resources there. The old policing use future is, well, let's have the police car drive around.
So I would need to be a little bit sensitive to who I listen to about who's telling the answer of what is the future.
Well, the success factor is asking, is this used or is this innovative? If I'm designing new pedagogy or schools, I would ask myself, you bring in a new technology, but kids are still in a row. Is the design used or is it innovative?
So is the policy solution more of the same?
Yes.
Goes back to the timing and the pattern, understanding that.
So one is default, challenge the default. Second, challenge the use. Third is look for emerging issues. What's changing the world?
So this is where we bring in the pillar of forecasting methods.
Yeah, the anticipation.
Yeah.
So I need to always be looking at the weak signals, the disruptors, so I'm aware of how the world is shifting. The fourth one is alternatives. Don't think of one future, think of many. The scenarios. I know we worked with doctors many years ago. Scenario 1 was corporatization. I said, what's the second scenario? Well, scenario 2 could be listening to the patient was called back to values. Scenario 3 was basically doctors disappear, technology takes over, tricorders, etc. Then I said, well, what's another one? And the fourth one became the multi-door health center, which brought in multiple perspectives. So by going outside one, they got many.